picturesque village in the mountains. Along the way, I ran into two travelers from France, and we decided to finish the hike together. After we were done, we stopped for a meal before catching a bus back to civilization. In the small restaurant, we remarked on how tipping the waitstaff isn't a thing in China like it is in the West. Without missing a beat, one of my travel companions said, "But they'll get that soon." That thought has stuck with me for years. The intuition was that China was developing and that development would make China more Western. Since tipping is common in Western cultures, China would adopt tipping. The tipping example seems laughable. That's probably why the offhand comment stuck with me for so long. Tipping does not seem like an inevitable consequence of economic development, but the logic that spreading modernity will lead to cultural homogenization is a lot more compelling for people when it comes to things like individualism. It's easy to see why. In some ways, it's obviously happening already. By one account, one language is going extinct every 10 days. People in 80 countries can order a Starbucks latte, and people in more than 190 countries can watch Netflix. It sure seems logical to conclude that modernization is making us more similar. But when researchers have actually tried to document the size of cultural differences over time, the picture is far more complicated and more interesting. For example, when they analyzed cultural differences in the World Values Survey from the first year of the survey in 1981 up to 2022, based on issues such as how to raise children and the importance of self-expression, researchers found that countries have grown increasingly different in their values, not more similar. This feels wrong. Over the same period, the world has become more interconnected, more educated, more urbanized, and more similar in GDP per capita, but cultures have somehow become more different in their values. To dig into this question, my colleagues and I began tracking what happens to people who move to more modernized environments. We couldn't force people to move to modern cities just to suit our scientific curiosity, but we hit upon the idea to track one group of millions of people who are already doing that. Every year, about 10 million students across China start college. Many of those students move. Some move to a nearby town, and some move thousands of miles away from a tropical to a subarctic region, or from a tiny village to a mega city like Shanghai. If you think about it, all that movement is like a giant field study in the power of the environment. What happens when you send a malleable 18-year-old to a new environment? We tracked 1,462 students who moved to 18 universities all over China. The schools were a diverse bunch, from the most competitive national universities to small vocational schools. They also covered a broad range of geography, from huge cities that many in the West have heard of, such as Beijing and Shanghai, to towns that even people in China might have difficulty finding on a map, such as Zhoukou and Luzhou. We then gave those students a test psychologists use to measure cultural differences in how people think, one that's based on how they categorize objects. Participants look at images of multiple series of 3 items at a time, such as a panda, a banana, and a monkey. For each trio, they must choose which 2 items belong in the same category. The trios of objects have been carefully selected by researchers so that 2 objects in the trio are in the same abstract category. In this example, pandas and monkeys are mammals, while 2 share a functional connection. In this case, monkeys eat bananas. The idea is that people's answers reveal something fundamental about how they think, specifically whether abstract relations are more of a priority to them, suggestive of an analytic thinking style, or whether they rate functional relations as more important, suggestive of a holistic thinking style. These thought styles are connected to things people do in everyday life. In school, analytic thinkers tend to pick majors that involve abstract thought, like engineering or mathematics, and they're less likely to play group sports. Holistic thinkers are more likely to pick majors that involve social interactions, such as early childhood education. They are more likely to play group sports, and they're more likely to conform to what other people are thinking. The categorization task we use to measure thinking style might seem silly, but it has a rich history in psychology. When researchers have given this task to people in different cultures, they've found that people in collectivistic cultures, such as China, Japan, and Brazil, tend to create abstract pairings less often than people in individualistic cultures, such as the United States, the United Kingdom, and Germany, which has been taken to reflect a predilection for more holistic thinking in collectivist cultures versus more analytic thinking in individualistic cultures. This chimes with what the Harvard researcher Joseph Henrich argued in his book, The Weirdest People in the World, 2020, that analytic thought is one of the traits that makes weird cultures, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic, psychologically peculiar compared with other parts of the world. We picked up on this logic in our research. If modernization is making cultures more Western, then modernization should be making people more analytic. Back at the universities, we measured students' thought style when they had just arrived from their hometown. Then we tested them again at the end of their first semester, and again 3 years later. That allowed us to track how their thought style changed over time based on their migration experiences. That is, whether they'd moved from rural to urban, poor to wealthy, east to west, north to south, or from a traditionally rice farming area to a wheat farming area, or vice versa in each case. Contrary to the idea that modernity has a flattening effect, we found that people who moved from rural areas to big cities did not lose their holistic thought style any more than others. It was a similar story for the influence of economic development, another proxy for modernization. If anything, people who moved to wealthier places retained more holistic thought over time than others. What did seem to affect students' thinking style was whether they moved to regions with a long history of rice farming, like Shanghai, or wheat farming, like Beijing. Students who left rice areas for wheat areas saw an 11% drop in their degree of holistic thought in just a single semester at college. Farming might seem far removed from how people categorize objects, but over generations, these crops could have shaped how important relationships were in putting food on the table. For thousands of years, rice farming has required more labor than wheat farming, about twice as much. To deal with that demand, rice villages developed customs for sharing labor. Rice farming was also built on irrigation networks. Those systems meant rice farmers had to coordinate their behavior more than wheat farmers. For example, some irrigation systems required rice farmers to flood and drain their fields at the same time. In contrast, wheat farmers mostly relied on rainfall, and it rains on their farm fields, whether they coordinate with their neighbors or not. These histories seem to matter even for the students who didn't travel to a different region for college. Among them, over the 3 years of study, differences in thought style between those in wheat versus rice farming regions actually widened. At the start of college, the contrast in thinking style between students in rice versus wheat areas was small, just 2%. But 3 years later, it had widened to 13%. In other words, the influence of the deep cultural traditions of these regions was not just persisting, despite any influences of modernization, it was growing over time. To be fair, our research looked at just one measure of cultural thought style. Skeptics might ask whether categorizing monkeys with bananas or pandas really speaks to larger cultural patterns. But recent datasets are suggesting that this is not an isolated finding. In a separate study, I analyzed rice/wheat differences in China's census data going back to 1982. I looked at census data because studies have found that collectivistic cultures tend to have different demographics. They have fewer divorces, fewer people living alone, and more people living in extended families. When I analyzed differences in China, oddly enough, rice/wheat differences were larger in the most recent census in 2020 than in 1982, when China restarted its modern census, once again suggesting a continuing influence of deep cultural traditions. These sorts of historical cultural legacies are not just over there in places like China. In the US, researchers have documented a legacy of herding culture in the South. Herders were vulnerable to theft. In an hour of inattention, a thief could steal a rancher's entire herd. It'd take a lot longer for a thief to make off with a field of rice or wheat. That meant herders had to defend themselves and present a credible threat to thieves. Add to that the fact that herding supports only sparse populations, which makes it hard to support police forces and courts. That ecological logic could explain why regions of the US settled by herders have higher rates of honor violence than places settled by farmers. That's despite the fact that only a tiny sliver of the population is still herding in these areas. The mountains of Peru and Bolivia offer another intriguing example. Starting in the late 1500s, the Spanish government forced people in villages near silver and mercury mines to work in the mines once every 7 years. This program ended in the early 1800s, but researchers found people in these villages still feel less connected to their regional government and believe less in democracy, compared with people in nearby villages who were just a little bit too far from the old mines to be made to work in them. Why is the psychological influence of cultural tradition so stubbornly persistent in the face of modernization? One possibility I find intriguing is what I call the seed model. The idea is that modernization might act like water on a seed, allowing differences to grow. Modernization gives people money, technology, and resources. If the way people choose to use those resources is based on the values and beliefs that were already in their heads thanks to cultural tradition, then it's easy to see how adding money could increase cultural differences. That force could be counteracting the flattening forces of Starbucks, Netflix, and global capitalism. While there are reasons to be pessimistic about the loss of culture in the modern world, the thought style data from young people in China is giving reason for optimism. Students in modern China are somehow learning cultural ways of thinking that are rooted in histories of farming. I find this hopeful because I find the alternative depressing. Modernization could be a steamroller, flattening all the interesting wrinkles and creases of culture that have accumulated throughout history. And perhaps I'm just tired of the cognitive tax that tipping culture imposes on us in the US, but I'm happy that my French hiking companion's prediction hasn't come true. It's been almost 20 years since our hike, but travel guides are still telling Western visitors not to tip at restaurants in China. And that cultural difference is still making for delightful stories, like the